program, which provides data to irrigators and is well known for his long time work in Arizona. You haven't said how many years you're here, but when did you join the university?
85.
85. Oh, so 30 years. Wow. I don't think it's a good prize, good award for that.
Crystal ball.
The crystal ball. Okay. I don't know if one judges that is good or not, but we'll leave that as it may be. So anyway, we have two of the team to talk to us today. But very quickly, before I turn it over to them, I'd like to do an introduction. You just introduced yourself and your affiliation. And if you traveled from another area of the state here. So we'll go around the edge of the room, and then come back to the table.
My name is Said Khalil. I'm with the USGS.
Can you read them? I'm from the USGS.
Down little with water content and the groundwater using the 5%. Keith McLean, Associate Director of the Water Resources Research Center.
John McKinney with FICO and Farmers Water Company.
In Rosebeer, I represent about 75 farmers, landowners, and businessmen in Yuma.
William Kelly Jones, I'm a student of the university.
Well, I've already
Mike Caparoso, those are resources.
Jerry Thacker, I'm one of the original farming families in Yuma. We're still on land there, but
Marco Garcia, retired professor of Rebecca Bama, the water environmental student. Julia McKenna with Montgomery.
Ian Passos, co-director of the New West Center.
Chuck Irvin, Soil Water Environmental Science. I'm Jim Walworth, Soil Water Environmental Science.
well, thanks for bringing out some of the colleagues here. It's great to see some of you over here. And we do broadcast our seminars through a web-based system, and I don't know how many are on there. They'll get to listen. They don't get to talk to us, but they'll get to listen. And let's see, do I have everything? Just please sign in, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill. He's going to lead off.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. A couple of questions first. How many here are from U of A? Oh, yeah. I don't remember. And how many are from or are in Yuma? That's good. Okay. All right, just curious. Well, I appreciate you.
Like Yuma.
I used to live there too. I lived there a long time ago.
Good taco stand.
Yes. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. This is the first time I've done it for this particular study, and so I'm looking forward to questions that may come up later. I'm going to be covering sort of the historical perspective as to things like water rights and things that really are necessary in order to develop the types of crops and so on that exist in the Yuma area. And then Paul will explain the details of how that happens. So anyway, I'll go ahead and start. And Sharon, if somebody wants to interrupt, I think it's a good time to explain something if there's a question. This is a map of the entire Colorado River Basin outlined in white. The line through the middle separates the upper basin from the lower basin. It crosses the river at a place called Lee Ferry, and that was important in the 1922 compact, which I'll get to in a few moments. The law of the river is a term you may see in newspaper articles and other places from time to time. It's sort of a general term that includes all the contracts, policies, treaties, compacts, everything that's taken place from a legal standpoint on the Colorado River, all the way from its source in Colorado to the Mexican border. Complex and interwoven. And those of you that have had experience with it know what I mean by that. I'm going to hit a few things that are kind of scattered a bit, but the water supply in Arizona, just to show the relationship, out of the total amount of 7 million acre feet used per year, 2.8 comes off the river, 1.6 to CAP through the pumping plant at Lake Havasu, and the on-river use of 1.2, which includes Yuma, the Colorado River Indian tribes, and some other users up and down the river. Water use in Arizona, get a perspective of agriculture, municipal use 21%, the industrial use 5%, and agricultural use 74%. This is anybody who had briefings like this is a favorite of the Department of Water Resources. Now you've been reading about the shortage, a potential shortage on the Colorado River, 15 years of drought. We kind of missed the bullet this year for calendar year 2016. Essentially zero chance of a shortage next year. This particular chart shows 47% likelihood of tier 1 shortage in 2017. I think that's less than that now. It does vary every time the Bureau does a study. Now, the shortages that were defined by a group put together at DWR and the Bureau goes into tiers. I'll just talk about tier 1 for a moment, because what it shows is that agriculture and underground storage in central Arizona is the first to lose water in a shortage declaration. And as you can see, the city of Yuma and Yuma Ag is not touched at all. Now, as a result of the, in part, the potential shortage on the river, it was decided to do a basin-wide study. Turned out to be the Colorado River Basin Water and Demand Study. And it started in January 2010, was completed in December 2012. The Bureau of Reclamation, both the upper basin and the lower basin, contributed, as well as all 7 basin states. They defined the current and future water supply and demand imbalances and developed and analyzed strategies. Key point, though, is over the next 50 years, there's going to be shortfalls under their analysis. Within year 2060, somewhere around 3.2 million acre feet of water shortage per year. That generated a lot of excitement all through the basin, because when those things are talked about, the first look is at agriculture. And so it excited a few people around, particularly in the Yuma area. Didn't want to lose the water. This is the team that put together this report, which was the reaction to the basin-wide study. We want to do our own study to show the benefits of agriculture in the Yuma area. And I won't go through them all, but as Sharon said, Dr. Brown and myself were 2 of them. Most of those on there are irrigation district managers, but as you can see, there's 4 reps from the University of Arizona. So we had quite a mix of people, including Mark Smith, who's a farmer in the Yuma Irrigation District, also president of that district, and he provided a lot of input to this study. Ann Castle, some of you may have met. She was an assistant secretary of Interior a few years ago and resigned. She made a statement at some meeting, I'm not sure what meeting it was, but she said, although about 80% of Colorado River water goes to agriculture, we would be unwise to assume that we can address shortages solely by removing irrigation water from farms. Retiring too much farmland will harm our economy in the Southwest, our food security, and our quality of life. Further improving efficiency, judicious switching to less thirsty crops, and using science to grow more with less water will be essential. But we must be careful not to destabilize rural economies that are the foundation of the basin. We felt that was an important concept to repeat, so we put it in the forward of this report. The study outline we decided on fairly early to discuss first the water supply situation in Yuma, the infrastructure that's used to deliver water to the districts and then to the farms, irrigation management, which gets into efficiency of the delivery of water and the use of the water, the economic value of agriculture in the Yuma area, and a segment on environmental considerations for the one environmental representative I see down there on the table. Okay, long history of water in Yuma. The Yuma and Gila projects are authorized to provide the irrigation water and the water delivery systems. But competition, even back in those days, was a concern, particularly of states other than California, because California was the one that was heavily using Colorado River water. The Imperial Irrigation District, for example, was using maybe 3 million acre-feet of water a year out of 7.5. And I didn't mention that earlier, but the two basins under the compact are 7.5 million acre-feet each. But California was using more than its potential allocation. The agricultural water rights in Yuma are among the oldest and the best on the lower Colorado River. And certainly water management is unique because the Bureau is essentially the water master acting for the Secretary. And because of things I'll cover a little later, that's a very important concept. All releases from Glen Canyon and Hoover are under the purview of the Bureau of Reclamation. And due to the operational structure of the basin, there's an emphasis on accuracy in placing orders, and I'll skip the rest because I'll cover that a little bit further, a little bit more complete later. Early water use dates from the 1800s. Some of you are aware that some of those early diversions were washed out by the regular floods on the Colorado River, and the big flood that took water from the Colorado to the Salton Sea, 2 full years. There was no water in that Salton sink then, but the Colorado River filled it up. Yuma project was one of the first projects. The basin-wide competition I mentioned led to the compact, which divided the upper and lower basin with the 7.5 million acre-feet. Quite a few other provisions in it, but that's what's key for this presentation. And that also led to the Boulder Canyon Project Act, which was passed in 1928. It became effective in 1929. It authorized Hoover Dam, Imperial Dam, the All-American Canal, and several other features. It also provided allocations of water in the lower basin. Now there's a difference. The upper basin had a compact, and they divided the water among themselves, by themselves, and they did it by percentage. The lower basin couldn't really agree, so the Boulder Canyon Project Act allocated the 4.4 million acre-feet to California, 2.8 to Arizona, 300,000 to Nevada. It also established the Secretary as water master. And you'll hear some repetition of this as we go along, and some of this I think will actually be in some of Paul's presentation as well. But as water master, what that means is you have to have a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation in order to use water on the lower Colorado River. It's just a flat rule. Now, over the years, there's been diversions that were not strictly according to that requirement, but the Bureau is cleaning that up. So it's a real critical element that you have to have a contract to do it. Or if you're an Indian reservation, you have a reservation. It's not a contract per se. And then the Arizona sued California. The decision was in 63. The decree came out in 64. It did confirm the allocations of water that were in the Boulder Canyon Project Act. Arizona has a priority system, unlike the other states. It involves, of course, how to divide up the 2.8 million acre-feet on the river. PPRs are present perfected rights, and they're rights that existed prior to 1929, which is the effective date of the Boulder Canyon Project Act. Those are first priority, and I'll get into the districts that have the various priorities in just a little bit. Federal reservations and perfected rights established before 1968 are second priority, and those two priorities are basically equal. Third priority rights are held by water users that executed contracts with the reclamation prior to September 30, 1968. That date is the date of the authorization of the Central Arizona project. Second and third priority rights are co-equal. I'm sorry, I said first and second. Second and third are co-equal. Fourth priority rights are those that came after September 30, 68, and that includes the Central Arizona project and all the subcontracts that are part of the CAP. And all fourth priority entitlements are co-equal. The fifth priority is any unused Arizona entitlement, and sixth priority is surplus Colorado River water. And for the past several years, as you can imagine, with the drought and so on, fifth and sixth doesn't provide much water. The water rights for agriculture in the Yuma area, as I've said several times and probably will continue, they're long-standing, complex, but they're unique. The water rights are a combination of the PPRs that I mentioned, the present perfected rights, and contractual rights. And the PPR is the oldest and best water rights in the lower Colorado River. Just a aerial photo showing the Yuma area irrigation districts. They go all the way from Texas Hill on the east side of Mohawk on the Gila River, and they go all the way to the Mexican border down in the lower left. This is sort of a schematic that shows the relative locations of the various districts. And you'll notice a barred water district there that's actually in California, but it was part of the Yuma project that diverted water out of the Yellow American Canal through the reservation division, which included the barred water district, and then goes across the river for Yuma Valley. The largest district area-wise is the Wild Mohawk district, with the Yuma County water users coming in second. Okay, these are the various entitlements and priorities of the water users in the Yuma area. First one is Wild Mohawk. They have a consumptive use contract of $278,000, third priority. What that means is that they can divert more than $278,000, but they'll get return flow credits, and I'll define that a little bit more later. So, but the consumptive use is limited to $278,000. They're also limited to acreage. Yuma County Water Users Association is a beneficial use. That's an old right. It goes back to the early 1900s. Basically, what their right says that they can use as much water as they need to, as long as it's beneficially used. The estimate is essentially 254,000 acre feet, and that's first priority. That's the best right. The next three, Yuma Mesa Irrigation District, Yuma Irrigation District, and North Gila, share an entitlement. That entitlement is 250,000 acre feet per year. So that's not defined per district. It's a shared entitlement. And they're all third priority except North Gila, which has a little bit of present perfected rights dating back to when Laguna Dam was built in the early 1900s. And Unit B, which used to be part of the Yuma project, used to get water pumped up from the valley, the end of the East Main Canal. They have first priority rights. So you can see there's no fourth priority in there. These are all first, second, and third priorities. And I didn't mention the Indian reservations, but they're in there too, of course. Management of the river as I mentioned before, is a different concept because it's operated by the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, acting for the Secretary. And all water releases are due to the law of the river. Releases from Hoover Dam, and people tend to get confused over this, they have a priority order. First priority is river regulation, then improvement of navigation and flood control. Second is irrigation, domestic uses, and third is power. And that's where there's been disagreements over the years as to how power stands in this, but it's definitely the lowest priority. And the Bureau schedules water out of Hoover based on downstream orders only. And that's important, as we'll get into when we talk about the over deliveries. Parker Dam is the last facility on the river where the Bureau has control of releases in the river. About a 3-day trip, 2.5 to 3 day trip from Parker down to the water users. During that period of time, there can be storms, there can be a freeze, other things that might change the orders. That being the case, there was an attempt to try to find a place to store the water when there's too much, or use it if there's not enough. And that resulted in, toward the bottom, you see there, Center Wash Dam, which was built in 64, 65, and the Brock Reservoir, which was constructed more recently. They're to try to accommodate those shortages. So the importance of this particular slide is you have to be as accurate as you can be when you order water, because if too much gets there, it goes above the deliveries of water to Mexico, which then does not count to their allocation and to their treaty requirement. So it's an amount of water that's lost to the system. The infrastructure part is, I'll go through a number of areas here that it was recognized early on, and in the report, there's some like a diary or a report that was made by some people that went there in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they were impressed about the productivity of the soil. Then beginning in the late 1800s, the construction of infrastructure began, and first water was delivered to Yuma Valley fields in 1910. I think there was some that was delivered earlier, but it was by makeshift diversions that probably didn't last any high water. The North Heel Irrigation District received water about the same time. The early irrigation practices were less efficient, both at district and at the on-farm level. They used earth ditches and delivered to farms, and the fields themselves were not as well prepared as they are today. That story began to change in the 20th century. In the 60s and 70s, issues with salinity of the Colorado River began to influence the infrastructure within Yuma area. And that was primarily because of drainage water that was coming from the Well-Mawk district that entered the system in 1961. Largest changes, though, came about because of the food industry. Farmers were adapted readily to consolidated production processes. There was a shift to the Yuma area as a center for vegetable production. I think most people recognize that today. But as it transitioned into this production, there were more opportunities and challenges to talk about the quality, the uniformity, and yield that was based on the Yuma growers. So we went to a more precision management, and we'll hear more about that from Paul. Also prompted a need for greater irrigation consistency and efficiency, both at the district and on-farm levels, and the farmers responded. The volume of system losses to evaporation, seepage, and phreatophytes in main canals are highly dependent on whether the structures are lined or unlined, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But within the Yuma area, there's a large number of lined canals, and when you compare the Yuma districts with many districts in the upper part of the basin, you'll see that the linings are much more prevalent in the Yuma area. 70% main canal line, 90% of laterals, and 80% of the ditches are all lined. There were numerous other changes to improve water efficiency. Modifications of the conveyance systems, turnouts, and basically also the implementation of improved water ordering and scheduling. They have a SCADA system, supervisory control and data acquisition, in some of the districts, but not all the districts. Mechanical land leveling has resulted in improved water distribution. I'm hitting this quickly because I know Paul will get in more detail. Precision field leveling using lasers. Also, alternate delivery systems, sprinklers and drip. And growers may irrigate the same crop using more than one irrigation method to ensure that the volume of water needed to optimize production is delivered to the plant. And I'll mention at this point that many newspaper articles talk about irrigators, and I think mainly in Colorado and Utah, use more water than they need on crops because they don't want to lose their water right. Yuma farmers have realized that if you put too much water on, your yield goes down, and therefore it's better to optimize and give the plant only what it needs. And again, Paul will cover that. Now, this is the return flows I was mentioning. Yuma area is unique in this area in which you apply a certain amount of water to the land. The plant uses so much, you might need some water for other purposes, but much of that water will get back to the river. As long as it gets back to the river and can be used by other U.S. users under contract, or can be delivered to Mexico as part of their treaty, then it's considered return flows. And so the water that's been diverted by the ag district, if you subtract then the return flows that reclamation measures, and in some cases estimates, that becomes their consumptive use and is compared to their contract amounts. The important thing that we discussed quite a bit, the last sentence there, lining of canals enhances system operations, but does not necessarily result in increased water in the Colorado River for the various reasons I gave before. And that is the water gets back to the river, so it's not lost. But lining does help system operations by having better control over the water. Now, lastly, in Chapter 5 of the report, we cover the environmental considerations. There's been concern for many years about the effective operations of the dams on the Colorado River, lower Colorado River. And for that purpose, or for that problem, the wildlife refuges were established. And there's a number of them south of Davis Dam. But there was more concern later when the Endangered Species Act came out of potential problems in operations. So a study was started in the mid-90s, and it was decided and implemented in 2005, something called the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. It turned out to be an over $600 million program, half funded by the reclamation and half by water users. And I mean all water users in California, Nevada, and Arizona. And in Arizona, the farmers pay handsomely every year into that program. Other environmental efforts in the Yuma area include the Yuma East-West ones, which the city put a lot of effort and money in. They've done a tremendous job. And there's activities in the Gila River Channel in the Welton Mohawk area that the district there did following the flood back in the 90s. And there's a number of cross-border environmental efforts. That's it. John, try questions now? Or?
Yeah, well, and John's going to make a switch over to the presentation. Is there any quick questions for Bill before we go to Paul's part of it? Yeah, sure.
What years time frame was the switch over to production of produce in the United?
Pretty impressive.
We'll wait for that slide. Anything else? All right, so we'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Unlike Bill.
And I just want to remind people who may have come in late and not signed in to please sign in. Maybe you can help circulate the sign-in sheet.
Okay, I just want to also mention the two other co-authors on this chapter, and particularly Charles Sanchez, and people in Swiss know Charlie real well. He's kind of our remote scientist, but Charlie spent most of his career down in Yuma, and for many years did a lot of work on irrigation that people didn't know much about because there wasn't as much interest prior to this drought. So a lot of what I'm going to show today is work that Sanchez has done over the last few years, and then Kurt Nolte, who had a big role to play with the irrigation districts, compiling a lot of the information I'm going to present here this morning or this afternoon. So what I'm really going to talk about, there's the cover of the document, and this is a rather lengthy chapter, and I'm going to kind of tap dance across a few issues that I think are of relevance and of importance and perhaps haven't been publicized as well as they should have been. A bit about the agriculture there, the water use trends, some of the irrigation management techniques that have been deployed, and then as a person who's worked in this now 30-some years, I think I have some ideas on what still needs to be looked at, and interesting enough, the growers in general agree with us, or at least the irrigation district managers. Chuck just asked about the transformation of the Yuma agriculture, and I've actually gotten to live through this, which I guess is what 30 years of experience works. We have Yuma County area as a function of the major crop types, and the bar incredible transformation that's occurred in that industry since then. So the real issue there is that Yuma used to be kind of a traditional long summer-oriented cropping structure where citrus, cotton, and sorghum dominated the production. And now what we see is a serious decline in all three of these. We see stable production in alfalfa and small grains, and a massively expanded production of vegetables with growth in melons and Sudan grass being kind of a summer forage crop in the Yuma area. And this graph shows a slightly different way of looking at vegetable production. This is a graph showing the acreage in vegetables for often just one crop produced per year, with vegetables being a winter-centric crop. Most of the acreage now is in what we call double cropped or multiple cropped land. And these rotations are vegetables followed by something. So you could have three crops, or vegetables followed by any one of these more traditional crops that are grown in the summer. So that is the trend. And it is really impressive to see a six-fold change in acreage in a matter of 4 years. This has been a major transformation. Now, what's interesting in this, and this is information we gleaned from the districts, is that while there is a change to multi-crop systems, particularly a focus on winter vegetables, there is a general decline in water use in the Yuma area. And there's two graphs on there. One of them is gross delivery to farms and acre feet. And the other, which is the one I mandated when we were doing this, is it really translates delivery per acre as well, because there have been changes in acreage in the area. And what we see is that in both cases, there's a lot of noise here, but there is a trend downward in water use in the Yuma area. Now, if you take a look at the fluctuations, there are some causes that we've identified in this report. This is, we think, largely the result of the Salinity Control Act of 1974, which took acreage out of and water away from Welton Mohawk, but also put a huge increase in infrastructure in that district. Basically lined the canals, put in high flow irrigation systems throughout that valley, and reduced the water use. Now there's a second rise. And this we attribute to the vegetable transformation. And I'll get to that in a moment. An increase in water use caused by vegetable production. And then there's this change back down in the last 20 years that we believe is driven by improved irrigation management, technological change, some urbanization in the area, and also there have been some additional water transfers from the district as a result of legal obligations. I believe those are tribal. Is that right, Bill? Okay. What do I mean by the rise of vegetable production? This little segment of this graph from 85 to 90, where we see this big increase in water use, is also associated with a threefold increase in vegetable production in that 5-year period. And in the old days, and I can remember these, so I guess I am old, this is the way they germinated vegetables. They planted them, and they flooded the furrows. And they left that water in there for 7 to 10 days in what they call the subbing process. This kept the surface moist. The lettuce and other things are very shallow seeded crops. And as a result of that, it allowed for uniform emergence and also avoided the problems of crusting. Those things have largely gone away in the last 20 years. The elimination of most of the subbing in response to using sprinklers. And sprinklers have basically reduced the water used for establishing crops Charles Sanchez has a pretty good data set on this, 50 to 75% reduction in the water requirements. Oh.
There's a sound issue. So.
Okay. But if you take a look at kind of what the water use of the old crops were, and you draw a line across through the kind of new rotations, there's a trend toward a reduction in water use on a cropping acreage basis, even with double cropping, particularly if you're growing wheat or if you're growing spring melons. With these rotations, you're using to allow. So that's another reason we think that there's been less water use. Kind of shows the transformation on a monthly basis on how water has been used and distributed in the valley districts. This does not include the Yuma Mesa. This is one of these crazy circular graphs. You have to go around. In the valley districts in the 1970s and the 2000s, in acre feet, and as you go around, you can compare the water use between 1970 and 2000 on a monthly basis. And the point that we're making here is that this one really does show the transformation to vegetables. Notice that in the summer season now, there's a significant reduction in water use and water deliveries in the Yuma area, and that's because there's less cotton and alfalfa in the valley to accommodate the vegetable production. Wheat matures in spring down there, usually in April, so it's not using any water in the later summer. And then what we do grow as summer crops, which is sudan and cotton, are terminated often in July or early August, so the fields can be re-prepped to go back into vegetables. So that's the cause of this significant reduction. Now you see the vegetable industry coming in here, and in the fall, you see a higher water use as they establish vegetables and irrigate those vegetables up. And then there's another interesting quirk here, which is January, February, where there's less water being used. And the explanation we have for that, or at least I have for that, is with the loss of cotton and other summer crops, they no longer do pre-irrigation at this time of year, which is a standard operating trick for farm management before they establish cotton and other acres. So this is a very interesting trend that shows us seasonal dynamics of water use and how they've changed over the last year. Now, almost everything in the Yuma area is level furrow or level basin irrigation. That's just a simple schematic. You have usually a water source on one side of the field. You have a high flow system if at all possible, and you shoot the water across the system as fast as possible. These systems always have some inefficiency because the opportunity for infiltration is greater on the water source end as opposed to the tail end. So you do have a potential for deep percolation. So these systems have to be engineered with high flows and rapid advancement of water to become efficient. Now, when operated properly, these are pretty good. Application efficiencies are 80 to 85% when they're run correctly. And in many cases, Charles Sanchez, of course, suggests that many of our systems down there do operate at that level. What do they do to make this level basin work? First, you got to be level. So they level these fields almost every year. Secondly, you need a good, uniform, as Bill said, supply of water. So most of these level basin systems are running off of concrete canals, so the water flows uniformly through and there's less seepage loss. And finally, if you're up on the Yuma Mesa where it is very sandy, high flow turnouts so that you can put huge heads of water, huge quantities of water across the system in a hurry. And the third thing that goes on, and as an old farmer, always found this interesting, most farmers say the last thing they do is compress ground. These folks purposely do this. They run what they call compress wheels or bolas through these furrows. And the role of that is to crush down the clods and smooth this surface, essentially the same as soil cement and Rito, to move the water faster down the road. And this accelerates the movement of water and improves the efficiency in one HS.
Well, before you turn, that line canal photo on the right, is that water going in from tailwater or out, or what is that that's kind of flooded?
That's just a irrigation event going on.
Okay, so it's,
This
can
gate is
see
lifted
right
up and the water's
Yeah.
coming out into the field. Yeah. The other thing that Charlie Sanchez has documented and actually worked on quite a bit is the fact that in the last 40 or 50 years, there's been a great transformation down there to shortening irrigation runs. So it takes less time to get the water across. They're more efficient as a result. This is work that Charlie did down there working on various flow rates down the furrow and length of irrigation run to show that if you get your geometry right as well as your flow right, you can get dramatic improvements in what we call application efficiency, or the efficiency with which you can deliver the amount of water you wish to put into the soil. So this is work that Charlie's done. Got a whole series of publications that aren't too old that summarize these results. And I don't want to go into great detail on this. We put this in the report, and I always thought this was too complex. But the other thing that Charlie has done down there for many, many years is work on how to optimize the physics and the flow of these irrigation systems. And basically, all this is saying these are ways. These are basically curves that show how you get application efficiency and distribution uniformity estimates from various flow rates and timing of how long you let the water run down the furrow. Now, I don't want to go into great detail except the fact that Charlie actually, to his credit, did a whole bunch of this work and has the operational criteria required to make these systems work rather efficiently, well documented and actually available for public use and consumption, and has at the end of this run some extension programming describing how to best implement this on an on-farm basis. And finally, our friend drip irrigation comes up frequently. And as Bill said, there is some drip irrigation in Yuma, but not a lot. And the reasons for it are numerous. The advantages of drip irrigation are it's a uniform water application spatially. It, generally speaking, will reduce water use. And often, because of uniform distribution and less stress between irrigation events, you get improved crop performance. And in fact, if you go talk to Howard Wirtz up in Central Arizona, well, maybe not Howard, but if you talk to most farmers, they need both of these to make this really an economically positive event to implement. But there are disadvantages. One is cost. Second one is the field flexibility. Third is salinity. Fourth is non-uniform germination in vegetables. And the fifth is our friend capacity limitation. And this is a common problem in the West. Pressurized irrigation systems tend to be under-engineered, which means they can't get enough water out during high evaporation periods, and you end up with potential for stress. Now, field flexibility is an important issue to the growers down there, and part of it has to do with the way they orient their cropping systems. After years of work, both science and I think hard knocks, they figured out which way to orient the rows of crops, and a drip system once installed would have trouble addressing these various orientation problems. Melons are east to west, vegetables are north to south. The bed width on these crops varies significantly, and then you end up with some crops that you grow in a level basin. So there's tremendous challenge and maybe resistance to drip irrigation because these fields are dead level and they want to be able to rotate their cropping pattern to meet the desires of the market and the crop they're growing. The second issue is salinity. And this is more of a graphical display, but this is a graphical display that Charles Burt did over in California in one of the irrigation districts. Here is a drip tube, subsurface drip tube, and underneath it you get very low levels of salinity. Either graph you can look at, but as you utilize the water up here by cropping and the water subs up through capillarity to the surface, you get a salt accumulation at the surface under buried drip or subsurface drip irrigation. So this is just a colored view of this type of graph showing an increase in salinity above the drip line. What that means is a disaster if you're trying to grow vegetables after an event like this, because the vegetables simply are not going to tolerate the salinity level. So fundamental rule of salinity management is leaching is the only thing that solves that problem, which means you have to add water in excess of what you're using for evaporation to move the salt down or laterally through drains. And the leaching requirements are a real issue, and the growers in Yuma clearly know that, and they do manage for salinity control as a result of that. The problem with subsurface drip is you have a zone up here that they cannot leach with the drip system, which means they have to come in and drain it some other way. I was just down there Tuesday. I have a weather station very close to this, and this is a produce field that's just germinating, and there's a drain. So you can see that there are drains all over the Yuma area to get rid of this water and prevent problems with salinity in the growing root zones. So the other thing that's very important here is that almost all of the vegetable crops are incredibly sensitive to salinity. Most of them we grow are sitting down in what we call the sensitive zones, asparagus being about the only one that seems to handle salinity pretty well. And as a result of that, the vegetable fields look like this, usually in August. They will come in, level those fields, work the ground, and they'll come in and flood them to leach that salt out so they can work them again. If you have a subsurface drip system, they're still going to have to come in and do this, or they're going to have to put sprinklers on to push the salt down into below the root zone. And leaching fractions are about 15%. That means 15% of the water on an annual basis that you put through the system has to leach out to keep the salts in check. And so this is the primary way in which they do it. This is usually the kind of thing Gary's been down there many years. You see this all throughout August prior to their planting of vegetables. And finally, there's a lot of talk about fallowing and whether that can save water or if you can pay somebody not to plant. And in parts of this region, this is probably a very viable option, but in Yuma Valley, there tends to be a saline groundwater that's not too far below the surface. And so if you fallow this surface and leave it dry, there will be a rise of water through capillarity. The water will evaporate, the salts accumulate, and you end up with a salt problem again at the surface. The graph on the right is something I took from Ayers and Westcott's work that simply shows this accumulation over a long-term period. So if you do this type of work with shallow groundwater, you may end up using just about as much water to reclaim that land when you want to subsequently use it. So fallowing with shallow groundwater is a bit of a challenge. Okay, very quickly, I'll finish up here because we're running out of time. The other thing that we've worked on, sometimes we question why we do these things, but we have worked on with Charlie, is irrigation scheduling. This is something that hasn't been particularly popular down there for many years. I think the growers feel they can do it pretty good themselves, but we've tried to implement some scientific scheduling techniques, which really are based on figuring out at what level of soil moisture deficit in the soil we need to be for various crop production, to optimize production. Charlie Sanchez has done a bunch of this work, but the bottom line is that this is your entire column of soil water. Only about 25% of it is actually utilized in management. The rest of this water down in here is either unavailable or is available only under stress. So a grower will try to manage really the top 20, 25% of his water. And if he fails to do so, he will see his yields decline as a result of water stress. These are all kind of time-honored curves. I worked on this as a grad student, so I know this is ancient data. The other thing we've worked on, and this is one of my projects for 30 years, is to run weather stations as a means of improving estimates of crop water use and irrigation management. And that requires that the weather station, which measures the energy and the transport of air, what we use that for is a measure of environmental evaporative demand, and then we have to develop some way of converting that to the water requirements of the crop in question. And we've done that in Yuma to some degree with poorly funded, but projects that work pretty well, putting lettuce and lysimeters. These are just buckets of soil you weigh, change in weight, change in water, water weighs something. You can monitor the change in weight, you can monitor the evaporative rate. We've been able to take these types of readings and convert them to what we call crop coefficients, which is the conversion factor for changing weather information into water use estimates. Finally, this is the interesting kind of last few slides I have here. We tried to look at a district-wide irrigation or a region-wide irrigation efficiency. Wasn't easy. But we did two types, and I'm going to show both results. And still not sure that we got these values greatly, but there are two ways to kind of do this. One is to look at the various cropping structure that's in an irrigation district, estimate the crop ET from weather-based information, like what I generate, multiply it by the acreage, that gets you the total water coming off the system, and compare it to water diverted to the farms. That was procedure one. Second procedure is to, and this was done in the Welton Mohawk Irrigation and Drainage District because their record structure was much better, and also because they had this possibility. Welton Mohawk is almost a closed irrigation district. Water comes in, and because of groundwater concerns, water is pumped out, put into a canal, and sent down to Mexico. So the Bureau of Reclamation monitors the salinity of the water that comes in and the salinity of the water that goes down the drain. And by comparing those two, you can get a measurement of the leaching fraction, assuming a steady state situation, and come up with an efficiency estimate. So we did both of these measurements. Procedure number one generated all kinds of confusion. This is the on-farm irrigation efficiency with crop water use estimates. There are two vertical bars here. One of them is unadjusted, the raw, horrible truth, and the other is the adjusted, which is an adjustment we made because the acreage numbers between all of the reporting groups, the Bureau, National Ag Statistics, and the districts, none of them agree. This is a problem, folks, in data collection at the federal level. We have a problem with acreage numbers and what's growing and when down there. So we made some adjustments. These are the raw numbers, ranging from the upper 40s to about 70% efficient on a district-wide basis. And then we made some adjustments to make sure the acreage numbers made sense. This boosted everything, and because I don't like to do anything in a one-directional positive bias, we left these in there. These get up around 75% efficient on a district-wide basis, but we felt a little insecure about that adjustment. So this is why we went ahead and did the salt balance. And the Bureau data only went back, or at least Charlie Sanchez was only able to go back to 2004 to get this data. But this is a monthly assessment of irrigation efficiency based on the salinity of the water coming in and the salinity of the water going out. And there's a couple of interesting things that come on there. There is a general trend upward from about 70 to 75%. The efficiencies are a slight upward trend, but you can see there are dips, periods of low efficiency. Most of those line up with the germination of vegetable crops when we have less efficiency because we have to keep the system wet. And they tend to peak in the late summer months when we're growing deeper rooted summer perennial crops. So this is the result of this work We feel this is a little bit better result, but there are some limitations even for this particular study on district-wide efficiency. And as I close this discussion, I want to make one point that I'm working on another project with NRCS, and some of the NRCS people that built the Welton Mohawk Irrigation District rebuilt it back with the Salinity Control Act funds. I was up visiting with them on a different matter the other day, and I showed them this and mentioned this, and they said, wow, this is about what we thought that district would run when we got it finished, about 75% efficient. So these numbers may be closer to the truth than we know. For those of you who think, well, what about the other 25%? 15% of this water has to be lost for leaching. So these are pretty efficiently run districts right here. Whether the other districts would show up this way, we don't know because we can't get at as equivalent numbers to do that. Finally, just a comment or two. This is the trend in pounds of lettuce produced per acre inch of ET, not acre inch of water use. That might not be quite the same curve, but the lettuce industry in particular has now doubled the productivity in the last 40 years of lettuce. They produce twice as much lettuce today on about the same amount of water. That's not all irrigation management. That's production, genetics, everything built together. But if you look at every other crop down there, including our old friends cotton and durum wheat and other things, they still have the same trend. They just aren't as dramatic in terms of their increases. Finally, just as a scientist or as a person who works in this, here's some things that still need to be done. This is a state that is woefully behind in examining crop water use, crop water needs. Much of the data that we still rely on for regulatory and other purposes is 40, 50 years old. It's the old work done by the Water Conservation Lab back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And a lot of it doesn't cover the new vegetable crops. We still have some concerns about salinity issues in Yuma. Jeff Silvertooth, who's my boss, he's now directing the Yuma Ag Center. We're working to perhaps develop some longer-term studies where we can look at the effectiveness of these leaching techniques that I've showed you, as well as this fallow salinity assessment. At the experiment farm, we can destroy a piece of ground or screw it up and get away with it. We go out on a grower's field, we never get there. Finally, Charlie thinks that we still have some room for improvement on sprinkler management. And also, perhaps with the interest in water today as it is, an improvement in scientific irrigation scheduling techniques, whether it be through weather station, ET-based systems that I've worked with, or adding soil moisture monitoring, or remote sensing through drones and other things to the irrigation scheduling system. These are all things that probably need to still be looked at. Not all the answers are out there. And it will certainly give me something to do, and as well as somebody who's 30, something to do for another 30 years. With that, I'll close.
Well, thank you very much. This is great. If anybody wants to do so, please come. Please.